Whoa, 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 stop right there, chat. Do you see that? That is a wild sandman. This is a rather amazing specimen. These things used to roam the plains of Upward, stunning all of God's most forsaken heavies from dusk till dawn. For years and years they would reign over this land, but now these things are practically extinct. And you know why? Because they got nerfed. We put them all in a pit trap, then we shot them. We fucking nuked the place. And to top it all off, we made him watch the Halo show. Yes, suffice to say, the Sandman is no longer what it used to be. And frankly, that's a good thing, because the old Sandman was a pain in the ass. In fact, everything in this game and in all games that is like the Sandman, that causes crowd control effects, is a pain in the ass. Some of you might know this firsthand. You may have been unfortunately exposed to the toxic effects of MOBAs and MOBA-influenced games, like Overwatch, where CC is a cornerstone of the design of many of the abilities in these games. It's part of how players engage with one another in this genre or style of video game. And you can probably tell my opinion on this mechanic A, by the title of this video, and B, by the fact that I don't make videos about MOBAs. I make tier list videos based on which celebrities I think would survive on Venus. But what is a CC? What is a crowd control effect by definition? And I think a good definition for crowd control is basically any effect which inhibits, manipulates, or prevents the normal functioning of someone's gameplay. This almost always comes about in the form of negatively manipulating someone's ability to move their character, and I think it's one of the worst mechanics that has ever graced video games with its awful presence. It's a mechanic that's almost always annoying and has no place in God's kingdom, and they're always bad. Right? Well, not really. You see, chat, crowd control effects are like Kaluka videos. Sometimes they're bangers, like my essay on the Upward ball tucker, my 6-part mini-series yelling at people who did nothing wrong, or the multiple controversies I faked for money. But most of them are generally tasteless and mildly offensive, like stuns, roots, and sleeps. If you do it correctly, if you add this mechanic with tact and with an actual plan in mind, then it is totally possible to make stuns that are not only interesting, but also healthy for your game. But unfortunately, a majority of the time, these are not the kind of stuns that you get. You don't get the really smart ones, no, instead you get the ones that people typically think of when they talk about CC and why they don't like it. The abilities that hit an opponent and then make them the victim of some form of debuff to their movement or ability to control their character for multiple seconds. Roots, slows, stuns, the works, which is what makes the Sandman such a fantastic example. The Sandman is pretty much everything that was ever wrong with CCs, and also an interesting little history lesson showing how the weapon was changed based on how people started to react to it. In case you weren't playing Team Fortress 2 in the Stone Age, the old Sandman was much different and much more powerful than the one we have today. Unlike the modern Sandman, which now only applies a slow if you hit somebody from far away, the Sandman in various forms used to apply a stun. At first, this stun was something that you could get from any range, which is outrageous and stupid, but as the weapon progressed, it was consecutively nerfed over and over again until it is what we have today. It went from being able to stun anyone from anywhere, to having a minimum distance before the stun would occur, to making it so that the stun only occurs on a max range hit and otherwise you get different effects, to being sealed inside of the moon like we have now, never to return. And frankly, that's a good thing, because no matter which version of the old Sandman you're talking about, there was no amount of nerfs that made it fun to deal with. And frankly, it's better for the game that there are no longer any stuns of any kind, and we're doing much better off. Oh my goodness, how unpredictable. Yes, the mittens. Yes, the Sandman is not the only stun in Team Fortress 2. However, the more astute among you might have noticed something very interesting about the mittens. They can still stun people. They have not been nerfed into oblivion like the Sandman has been. And the reason for this is very simple. But honestly, if anybody didn't know, I wouldn't be surprised. The Sandman suffers from a game design fundamental that, while simple once you understand it, is not very intuitive. And the phenomenon that the Sandman suffers from is called being fucking stupid. But what truly separates these two weapons? Why is one of them allowed to go around stunning people for like 5 seconds or however long Schadenfreude is, and the other one has been destroyed in its role and left with basically nothing but a shell of its former self? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And now that I've extended this video out to the point where now no matter what I do I can get mid-roll ads, we can finally discuss what's wrong with stuns, when they're okay, and what makes us tolerate them in the first place. First off, let's talk about CC. CC is again typically very frustrating, and it's mostly around the fact that they have an exclusively destructive effect on the game state, and again go against some of the nature of why we play games in the first place. First off, and I cannot believe this is actually relevant to the topic, but Emperor Hirohito will never make an effective point guard, and you should under no circumstances draft him for your fantasy league. And also, when people sit down at their chair, turn on their computer or console, pick a game, and then click play, what do you know? They then don't want to be affected by mechanics that make it so that they can no longer play the video game. Nobody wants to get stunned for a couple of seconds and basically just be putting down the controller for the duration of their CC. That's an annoying thing to have to deal with. It's almost as annoying as my comment section, and while I have your attention, I want to talk about something. No guys, I am never going to host anybody who steals from a homeless shelter on this channel.
What about me, mate?
It's not interesting or particularly skillful to be affected by a loss of control ability, especially considering loss of control makes you a prime target for a cascading effect. First you get stunned, and then because you're stunned, you get easily targeted by your enemies because you can't retaliate in any way against them. Even worse, you could be subject to multiple loss of control effects back to back. First you get stunned, and then the enemy dives on you because you can't escape or retaliate or defend yourself, and if you survive the initial dive, obviously the enemy doesn't want to allow you to escape, especially after they've just used some of their cooldowns, so they then root you or stun you or slow you a second time to be able to finish you off for good. This is not even a remotely fun thing to be hit by, and it's a fair complaint to say that the only part of this engagement or a similar engagement that would really matter is the first stun, since that's the thing that allows the enemy team to pile on so much more damage and other abilities or effects. It's not fun to get hit by anything in a game. No matter who you are, you're almost never enjoying yourself, especially if you're trying to actually win, to be doing things like taking damage, losing units, getting hit by spells, or whatever it is. Things can be frustrating when they're not going your way.
What? I'm above her! What the fuck?
And stuns are an especially frustrating thing to be hit about, again because they are inherently destructive. Let's imagine you're playing a game with your friend. Your friend hits you with a crowd control effect. Let's talk about what that crowd control effect actually now does. You've been hit by the CC. That was a mistake on your part. So now you have to play the exact same game you were just playing, if you're allowed to play at all, except your character is now an objectively worse version of what you were just doing. It's the exact same thing, but now you're just having to tolerate an annoying debuff. Nobody likes to get hit by things in a video game, nobody especially wants to get hit by goof maxing nonsense mechanics, and nobody wants to get hit by something which is bullshit, which then leads you to getting hit with other things that you can't control. Especially not when you can't wriggle your way out of it in any way after you've been hit, and nobody wants to do all of this while playing an FPS game, a genre where the three fundamental pillars are positioning, movement, and basal. These are supposed to be games about aiming at people, and using your movement to make it so that it's difficult for the other guy to aim at you. Using your positioning to make it so that people wouldn't think to aim at you, or they can't shoot at you even if they can. And look, I'm no expert, but the importance of these fundamentals might be slightly diminished when you hit somebody with an ability that makes it so that they can no longer reposition, move, or aim. I don't know, maybe not a good idea, but I would know because I donated my frontal lobe to charity. And with my surgery complete, I just wanted to say how excited I am for Skull and Bones. And even though these two weapons have the same effects, how they go about getting that effect is entirely different and is the deciding factor between why one of them sucks and one of them doesn't, and that would be the delivery method. If the effect of your CC is going to suck, and by the way, there's multiple different kinds of CCs, and not all of them have to be bad, then the delivery method is a large portion of how you can design this effect in a way that isn't awful. This is the difference between having something that's really frustrating to deal with and something that isn't that bad. This is the difference between the Sandman and the Holiday Punch. Once again, I still don't think that this gels particularly well with FPS games as a genre. Usually if people are going to get hit by something, they would rather just get hit by like, damage and have that be the deciding factor. But if you make your CC gun bad enough, they'll usually tolerate it. I wrote about this extensively in my paper describing how Congress should not decide on things based on a 2/3 majority, but instead should give total voting power to whoever brings the coolest thing to show and tell that week. But if you want the summary, again, just look at the Holiday Punch. You have to take the slowest character in the game, the biggest and easiest target to hit. In a game where people deal more damage the closer you get to them, get up behind somebody, hit them at a specific angle, and then kill them. Now luckily with my neurotoxin aura spell, you can shut down enough enemy synapses to be able to sneak in a kill here and there, but against players who actually look behind them, this is an incredibly difficult strategy to pull off. Again, compared to the Sandman, which is a projectile weapon, the Sandman is way easier, even if you're trying to hit max range hits to use. It goes from something that's so bad that it's funny even if you're the victim of it, to something that is just outright obnoxious. It's like the madcap joke, like at first it was funny and now this hilarity is part of what makes the Holiday Punch so endearing. There's no reason, on paper at least, that it should ever work. After all, it's a heavy melee weapon and every single class can hypothetically just run in a circle and heavy will never catch them. But it does work, and the sheer intensity of how difficult it is to get the backstab and then the taunt kill, combined with how easily countered it is, even by the heavy's own teammates, makes this weapon fun for user and victim alike. I've collected all this Holiday Punch footage on Uncletopia, the supposed big bad tryhard community that doesn't let you have any fun, and I've had multiple people either
turn friendly when they notice what I'm doing, or even outright root for me despite being on the enemy team, even after they're the ones who got Holiday Punch critted right before their Uber or whatever. If even your super sweaty, unshowered, non-toothbrushing gamers can do nothing but enjoy its presence, you probably did something right with your thing. But it's not just a matter of the Holiday Punch being funny, it's also good game design. There's a particular kind of player called a low-tier hero. A low-tier hero is somebody who gravitates towards weak characters or weapons, etc., which are overall very inefficient, but have some kind of powerful effect or ability hidden somewhere underneath all of the crap. For Team Fortress players, this would be spy mains, people who are willing to overlook their character's general inefficiencies like his low health pool or his bad heart to be able to get at that sweet succulent nectar in the center, which for us is backstabs. This of course extends beyond Team Fortress 2, and the incentivizing bait of whatever the powerful thing is mixed with the general weakness of the character means that these players have to be innovative, and whenever they're in a match there is now some kind of wacko running around trying to do some crazy strategy that no one else is prepared for, which makes the game far more interesting than having a CC that's so easy to hit that it's boring. The Holiday Punch makes creative, determined heavies. The Sandman in all forms just makes worse scouts. It's the same problem with Natasha. Natasha strips players and characters alike of their ability to move, so that what, some heavies can hit more shots even though they're not very good? Like, does that sound fun to you? Getting rid of one of the reasons one of the classes is even in this game and punishing everybody else just so that a bunch of mud eaters can aim less? Like, does that sound cool to you? No, of course it doesn't, but you know what is cool? Check out this guitar solo. However, all of this is of course only for stuns. Luckily for us, CCs are like Volkswagens. There's a lot of them, and maybe one or two of them won't break down after a week. As far as the hard CCs goes, stuff like stuns, roots, slows, things that say that you can't do something, I feel very generally that these sort of just don't belong in FPS games almost at all. To me, an FPS game is about shooting people, but it's also about shooting people in a way that's very liberating. It's about expressing your freedom through the game's mechanics, flying and jumping around the map using really weird and cool weapons, playing interesting, wacky characters on an interesting, wacky map with an interesting, wacky game mode. That's what's fun about this genre to me, and that to me is what Team Fortress 2 embodies. A really wacky but interesting arsenal on a bunch of well-designed characters, which is why I think that hard loss of control effects and even other things that slow the game down like, sniper, NG stacking, Bill, just don't make the game more enjoyable. But that doesn't mean that CCs are inherently always bad, and there's a little character that we all know and love that stands as a shining example of this. Of course, I'm talking about Spy. Pyro is a great advocate for CCs in FPS games. I'm fairly certain I don't have to explain this, but Pyro has a bum leg and a mechanic called Airblast. And Airblast is the best thing that ever happened to Pyro and one of the best things that ever happened to Team Fortress 2. Now, of course, I have to pay the discussion tax whenever I want to talk about Airblast. You gotta point out some of the problems with this mechanic. The hitboxes are way too big. Giving mini crits to reflected projectiles might be a bit excessive, but aside from that, Airblast highlights how not just a CC, but in particular knockbacks can be used to improve a game of this genre, and also why it's vastly better to have a softer CC like this than something that's hard like a stun. First off, knockbacks don't just make someone else's gameplay worse. Taking a character and forcing them into a new position does not make them objectively weaker than they were before. It simply changes how a fight is playing out and is therefore less frustrating to deal with. I also personally think that a good knockback requires more skill than a good stun. Assuming of course that both abilities are equally hard to hit, then hitting a knockback correctly requires you to not only hit the ability to begin with, but then to also push your opponent into a position that's disadvantageous for them. Pushing a soldier 2 feet down the street and pushing him straight into the pit that only ever plays Reddit retelling videos are two completely separate outcomes. Whereas after you hit a stun, like, they stop moving, you just walk over and fucking shoot them. It's just like going fishing. But again, knockbacks aren't just a less offensive CC, they make the game better, mostly by combining with geometric hazards. A geometric hazard is any part of the map that can damage or kill you. We're talking stuff like cliff sides, a pit full of spikes, traffic, mysterious humming cube in the woods, anything like that. Normally, these aren't something you really have to worry too much about. I mean, how often are you just gonna walk off the map? But when someone can suddenly force you to jump off of a cliff like you just discovered cold fusion, then they become much more dangerous, and it enhances the positioning aspect of any game. You have to be considerate about where you're standing, and things that would otherwise just be a silly map prop are now an important part of an engagement. A cliffside goes from just being a pretty part of the map to potentially being a trap with pyros or Force of Nature scouts lurking around waiting to pounce, and it enhances your game at pretty much every point. The best game to ever do it has gotta be Fistful of Frags for me. In Fistful of Frags, every single character has a minor knockback effect. It's one that they have to commit to, but they can all do it. Additionally, Fistful of Frags maps are filled with a bunch of different props, and if you get knocked into one of these props with this ability, you take additional damage, often causing you to just die outright if you were already damaged by something else. And this makes it so that positioning in this game is really difficult and very interesting. You have to know where to stand to shoot the most people, where to stand to avoid being shot, and how to approach your enemies while minimizing the chance that you get kicked off the map. But even in other games, this dynamic is fantastic. It's fun in every single game I've played, and I've played at least 6. And there is one thing that CC is very particularly good at no matter what game it's in, and that's diffusing powerful enemies. MOBAs typically have some kind of a progression system in them. Throughout the game, you kill enemies either for experience, gold, or both. Leveling up and buying items makes your character objectively better than they used to be. And obviously, if a particular enemy happens to progress faster than they're supposed to at a given point in the game, especially early on, they can become a problem for your team to deal with, especially without dedicating a lot of resources or players to doing so. But it's hard to be an overpowered character if you're stunned and can't move. And Pyro does the exact same thing with Ubers. Ubercharge, as you might be aware, has very little counterplay. If you're very lucky and you're playing on Suijin on exactly April the 13th at 4:55 p.m., the ancient magical talking carp will banish any players currently Ubered into the Shadow Sphere, but beyond that, there's not really much you can do about it. After all, Uber makes you invincible. You see, Uber is one of those really good mechanics because if you ignore all of the problems it creates, you can trick yourself, but one of the few characters that does get to interact with Uber is, of course, Pyro. As such, Pyro can keep dangerous Ubers or, in general, dangerous stuff away from his team, whether that be spies, incoming spam, especially dangerous projectiles like, a crit, or something even more unfathomably deadly like 15 seconds of exposure to Taylor Swift. People typically don't like Pyro because of the annoying things that he can do, but I don't know that people give enough credit to the annoying things that he can prevent. And again, this is what makes knockbacks better in my opinion. They have the potential to actually make the game more fun, which is something that I don't think stuns or roots or anything like that can do. They change the fights that they're a part of. They don't just make a certain element or a player inside of it simply weaker because they're a debuff. Maybe there's a world where somebody's already standing over or in a map hazard and then you stun them to get killed by it or something, but if someone's already being forced onto probably the worst part of the map or is just standing in it for some reason, damage will most likely do the trick in about the exact same way. It's just a very simple equation. Pushing people into traffic is a lot of fun, and it also makes for a great gameplay mechanic. But knockbacks aren't only just cool for the user, they're also sometimes cool for the victim. Team Fortress 2 applies a minor amount of knockback to all damage in the game, which is multiplied the moment that you're in the air. This allows for people to do what's called surfing, using the knockback from enemy damage to get around the map. And this mechanic is anything from just a stupid gimmick to the catalyst for extremely cool plays,
Oh, I just gotta surf!
or an unintended but very core part of a character's design. Like for example with Medic. Medic by design has no real movement or defensive options, so the ability to surf off of enemy damage and get yourself out of a bad spot can be incredibly clutch. And that's the thing about Team Fortress 2, right? Like, that's what this game is about. Incredibly wacky, interesting mechanics that are executed in a way that is competitively interesting. And that's what Airblast embodies to me. Because Airblast isn't just an example of a goofy way to throw people off a mountain. It represents everything that is cool about Pyro, as cool as Pyro can be, which is not very. And Pyro is cool for two reasons. Pyro is cool because he can get these silly combo kills, and he's cool because he has control. Not as much control as Beer has over my niece, but control nonetheless. Now, control isn't just some shit they made up like the Mars rover. Control is an actual archetype or playstyle in other much worse games like Magic the Gathering. When Hasbro Entertainment isn't too busy dunking Richard Garfield's last will and testament in PCP and smoking it off of a cheap hooker's back, they sometimes update Magic the Gathering, and frequently in every single Magic the Gathering set there is support for a control archetype. It's one of the cornerstones of this game and of card games in general. Control as a rule is very simple. It's about controlling the situation, trying to manipulate manipulate everything about what's currently happening to be beneficial for you. Now chat, I can see one of you is raising your hands in the corner. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
That sounds like what the FBI does.
And you're right, chat, that is something that you do in normal everyday gameplay. Obviously, if you're trying to win a game, you're not going to make it easy for your opponent. You're going to jump around so it's harder for you to get hit, you're going to try to damage them as much as you can, as fast as you can, and you're going to try to deny them space or resources. But that's not really what control is about. Control is about manipulating everything. Doing everything in your power to keep your opponent from actualizing their game plan as best as you can, and for that reason, control often suffers from the same criticism that CC does. It is afflicted from the same inherent problems as loss of control in that people don't really like it when you prevent their game plan. Typically they're fine if you're doing the same thing but better, like what are you really gonna do? Complain someone is out-moving you, out-aiming you, or is a better artist in Professor Heinsohn's Advanced Fundamentals of Form and Shape? You're gonna follow them to their dorm room and stab them with a pair of scissors? No, you're just gonna have to accept that they draw better and try to improve. It doesn't help that control decks in many card games, especially Magic the Brand Recognitioning, do so by designing cards that simply prevent the opponent from playing them, or cancel their effects even after the opponent has spent the resources to play it, which unless you're also playing a control deck, don't really feel like they're playing the same game that you're playing. You're trying to play Magic the Gathering by applying pressure, playing lots of different creatures or spells, and they're playing the deck. When every single one of your cards is getting counterspelled and everything that does actually stick gets destroyed, it's hard to feel like you're being bested by an equal compared to just losing to a bunch of stupid fucking cards. However, just cause this playstyle is naturally annoying doesn't mean you can't make control characters in a way that people actually respect. To exemplify this, I'd like to talk about fighting games. Where are you guys going? Fighting games also have control characters, but because the FGC has to keep their language to as few letters as humanly possible or else their brain overheats, they call them zoners. Zoners are very similar to control. They're almost identical, really. They try to orchestrate a game state that keeps the opponent from doing whatever they want. In this case, that means punishing their approach and saturating the screen with either fireballs or long-limbed attacks, or both to make it so the other guy cannot run up and hit you in the face. However, zoners have a fundamental difference, in my opinion, in how they execute this plan. Control often has effects that read, you can't do that. Counterspells and anything else like it make it so that you play a card, you pay for the card, but instead of getting the card you paid for, the opponent can just dismiss all of its effects and force your card to go straight into the graveyard or wherever else, which is very frustrating to deal with. Almost as frustrating as this color palette, especially if you're not also running your own counterspells to prevent this. Zoners don't have similar effects to this. They don't have things that just say you can't do that. Zoners aren't placing hardline restrictions on what's possible in the game. They just try to punish you for taking certain avenues of attack. And in any decently made game, which means anything not made by NRS, they can't cover all of the options. Zoning isn't about saying no to the opponent's playstyle, unless their playstyle is running at you without thinking. It's about constructing a trap that gets them to kill themselves from not knowing or not trying hard enough to overcome your patterns. Because of this, zoning is a skill, and zoners often have to exhibit many of the same skills that regular players do, just with a twist. Zoning is also something that only happens during certain parts of the game. Outside of the neutral game, zoners are just like every other character. Unlike control players who will have a huge plethora of different cards that are designed to either give themselves card advantage or deal with every single one of your threats before it can do anything meaningful. This leads zoning to being irritating, but if you're aware of the effort that a good zoner has to put in, especially against a strong opponent who is aware of their capabilities and knows what to do about them, you learn to respect their skills. Or of course you call them a swamp-dwelling cud chewer after the match, but that's your choice. Zoning can be a pain in the ass, but you know deep down that they're doing things that are smart, especially if you're a smart opponent and have plans to deal with their shenanigans. If you're not playing well, or you just don't know what to do about it, it's not their fault either. It's annoying, but it's fair, and unless the character they're using is incredibly poorly designed or balanced, you can handle the annoyances because seeing a strong player put the character into motion is cool. Unless of course they're playing Dalsum, in which case please go to hell. But I should probably interrupt myself to share with you this grotesquely overdressed dog, and also acknowledge a very solid counter argument to everything I've just said, which is that much of what I said can also be said about control players. I mean, after all, the deck of cards doesn't play itself unless it's Red Zoro, and much like how zoners have to carefully pick what moves to use when, so do card gamers with the cards that they play. I mean, just because your opponent has a counterspell doesn't mean you have to run into it when they are obviously representing it, and on the opposite side of the same coin, if a control player just counterspells every single thing that comes at them, they're going to miss out on the opportunity to do it to cards they actually need to. I'm not trying to dismiss the skills of control players, especially because I am one, but still I think there's two distinct differences that separate Pyro from something like like this. Firstly, neither zoners nor Pyro have any effects that just say you can't do something, like I said.
Except headshot.
Instead, they just try to punish you for having a stupid game plan or approach. Turns out, guys, you can't just shoot the Pyro with different guns, but beyond that, I think one of the real major differences, just at a genre level, and it's that fighting games and FPS games are both very freeform games. In a fighting game, as long as your character isn't already doing something else, you have access to your entire list of moves at any given point. Some of them might require a resource that you don't have, but that's about as limiting as it possibly gets, and you can try to utilize all of these moves at any given point to navigate the enemy's defenses. But card games aren't like that. Card games have multiple different factors, typically limiting how many cards a player can play in a given turn, and obviously that's a necessary evil. You can't have people just throw their entire deck at each other, that would be terrible. But when in the first handful of turns of the game, you can only play one or maybe two cards per turn, getting one of them nullified or quickly destroyed feels like you just didn't get to play the game for that given turn. You've lost that entire turn of tempo, and now you have to try to rebuild from there. Not to mention things like hand size maximums, meaning that you just lost one of your precious 7 or however many cards, and it can feel rough, especially when it happens multiple times in a row. And that's why I think Pyro is a lot better. Pyro has a softer touch. He controls many things in a way that keeps them from being painful, and which also doesn't prevent his victims from playing the game. He's not an enormous walking wall that puts you in timeout. He just forces you to engage with a singular brain cell. Maybe this time don't fire all your pills exactly on the beat of when you can, or maybe just walk backwards because it's the Pyro and set up a sticky trap. Or a stinky trap, you know what I'm saying. Or to Uber a specific character because of how they interact with the Pyro. And when control is working well, this is what it's doing. Forcing an opponent to think. And when Pyro's at his best, that's exactly what he does. And he does it in a way that's really fun. Really silly, sure, but really fun and really unique. And I have to say that after making this video, I think that Pyro gets kind of a bad rap. Of course, there are parts of Pyro that are really annoying. How easy it is to aim the flamethrower is an eye roll, dying to afterburn is an eye roll, the scorch shot is an eye roll, but every character in this game can be frustrating, even Spy. And Spy is like the worst character ever, and like anybody who likes this piece of shit should have to send me $50. And despite these annoyances, I think Pyro is a character that blossomed very well. The evolution of Team Fortress characters is actually something that interests me quite a bit, because frankly, any topic that isn't complaining about bots is a good thing at this point, and I'm glad that Pyro won out as well as he did. Pyro started off as a very bad character, and I don't just mean weak, I mean he was like really poorly designed. And frankly, if you're ever playing Pyro in a similar way to how he was when he first came out, he's still a bad character. WM1 Pyro is not offensive because it's easy or too effective or whatever, it's offensive because it's fucking boring. And I think one of the reasons I still enjoy Team Fortress 2, even despite all the times that it frustrates me or when it gets old, and it does get old, is because it's filled with stuff like Airblast. Mechanics that were either incredibly thought out or just added because they were fucking stupid and fun, but regardless, evolved characters in a way that made them more interesting and more multifaceted, and which showcases the same kind of fundamentals that something like the Sandman does, but without being so one-sided and frustrating. And hopefully once Team Fortress 2 starts to get a little bit older and it has games that are inspired by it coming out, those games won't throw out this incredibly important core design philosophy and instead just copy MOBAs for 10